This is the Daily Brief, one landmark court decision explained in plain English every day. Presented by FindCourtCases.com, this is your daily briefing on the law that shapes American life.
Today we're peeling back the layers on a decision that really in 1973 just redefined the boundaries of personal freedom in the United States. We're talking about Roe v. Wade.
We are, and we're not just, reciting facts from a textbook. We're trying to figure out why this one single court case felt like such a seismic shift for millions of people.
Right. And I think to do that, you have to start with the stakes. They were just absolutely massive.
They really were. You have to picture the world they were living in. This wasn't some abstract debate about a new regulation. It was about whether a state's criminal law could control one of the most intensely intimate medical choices a person can make.
It was about the limits of government power over your own body.
Exactly. And the immediate flashpoint was in Texas.
So you have Jane Roe, which was a pseudonym, of course. She's a pregnant, unmarried woman, and she wants a legal abortion.
But she can't get one. Under the Texas laws at the time, the only way was if her life was explicitly in danger.
So her choice was either an unsafe, illegal procedure or continuing a pregnancy against her will, all because the state had made the medical procedure a crime.
And it wasn't just about the patients. This is really key. You also have Dr. Halford, a licensed physician.
Right.
And he was actually facing criminal prosecution for doing his job, for performing abortions under these incredibly restrictive laws. So he's arguing the state is crushing his professional rights.
Okay, so if we strip away all the headlines and the years of debate that came after, who won that initial clash? Right there in 1973.
Well, the Supreme Court affirmed Roe's constitutional right to privacy in this decision, so she won.
Okay.
And what was lost? Well, Texas lost its ability to enforce those extremely broad criminal laws. The court essentially created a constitutional right that hadn't been explicitly named before.
And that's our mission for you today. We want to move past just knowing the name Roe v. Wade. We want you to really understand the specific legal framework, this balancing act that the Supreme Court created.
Because that structure, that way of thinking, it still informs almost every debate we have about personal autonomy today.
So if you need a one-sentence takeaway, what is it?
I'd say it's this. A state can't just ban or put an undue burden on a pregnant woman's choice to end her pregnancy before viability. Her right to privacy has to be balanced against the state's interests in health and potential life.
That balancing act.
That's the entire legal machine we're going to take apart today.
Okay, so let's start this story with the people involved, because it wasn't just Jane Roe. We've mentioned the Texas laws were incredibly restrictive.
And that's so important to visualize, that pre-Roe world. Doctors were under this intense legal pressure. Their medical judgment, which is supposed to guide health care, was just completely overridden by criminal law.
So we have Jane Roe arguing a violation of her privacy. We have Dr. Halford arguing for his right to practice medicine.
And then there was actually a third group, a married couple known as the Does.
The Does, right. And what was their argument?
Theirs was a bit more speculative. They were childless, and they argued about potential future harms if they were to get pregnant. But this is where the legal mechanics get really interesting.
Because the court didn't really focus on them, did they?
Not at all.
Yeah.
And it's a great example of legal concepts like standing and justiciability.
Wait, so why did the court just ignore their claims? I mean, they went through the trouble of filing a lawsuit.
Their claim was dismissed as not justiciable, which is basically the court's way of saying the injury they were talking about was purely hypothetical. It was a what if.
I see. So it's like suing the city because I might trip on a crack in the sidewalk next year.
That's a perfect analogy. Exactly. It's too speculative. Now, Dr. Halford, he had a very real injury.
He was being prosecuted.
Right. But the court also dismissed his claim for what's called declaratory relief. Basically, federal courts are really hesitant to jump in and stop state criminal cases that are already in motion.
So the court zeroes in on Jane Roe. Her conflict was the only one that was both real and immediate.
Real, immediate, and also what the courts call capable of repetition, yet evading review.
Meaning pregnancy is only 9 months, so the case would be over before it ever reached the Supreme Court. But the issue would definitely come up again for someone else.
You got it. And that allowed them to focus squarely on her fundamental injury. Which brings us to the biggest question in the whole case.
Where did they even find a right to abortion? It's not written in the Constitution.
Right, let's unpack that, because this is the foundation that changed everything.
Okay.
The court located this right inside the liberty component of the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment.
The 14th Amendment. And that clause says a state can't deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law.
Exactly. And the justices reason that liberty isn't just about freedom from physical restraint. It protects certain personal rights that are so fundamental, so basic to, a free society, that the government can't interfere with them.
But they didn't just pull that out of thin air, did they? I mean, there had to be a precedent.
Oh, absolutely. That's the crucial link. They were building on decades of case law. The court had already recognized this sort of zone of privacy around decisions related to marriage, procreation, using contraception, family relationships, how you raise your children.
All of these intensely personal decisions about how you structure your own life and family.
Yes, they had already established this constitutional zone of privacy. So the big question for the court was, does a woman's decision about terminating a pregnancy fit inside that protected sphere?
And their answer was yes.
A definitive yes. They cited just how profoundly that decision impacts her life, her health, her future.
That feels like a really big logical leap, though. The other cases were about the right to marry or the right to use contraception. Why was it legally necessary to include the right to end a pregnancy in that same bucket?
That's a fantastic question, because it gets right to the heart of it. The court felt that forcing someone to continue a pregnancy was such a deep intrusion into their private life, maybe more profound than any of the other things they'd looked at.
It involves bodily autonomy, economic future, everything.
Everything. The intrusion was so significant that it demanded the absolute highest level of judicial review.
So this right to privacy is established as fundamental. But you said something earlier that's key. It is not absolute.
Right, and this is where things get really nuanced. This is why that balancing act is the great legal innovation of Roe.
Because if a right is fundamental, shouldn't the government's hands be completely tied?
Normally, yes. But because this case involved the state's interest in protecting potential life, which is a much weightier concern than, say, regulating a business, the right couldn't be absolute. The state could have a say.
But it had to be a very, very good reason.
A compelling reason. That's the legal standard. A compelling state interest. The state couldn't just have any rational reason. It had to show a critically important, narrowly tailored reason for stepping in.
Which brings us right to that balancing act. How did the court decide when the state's interest became compelling enough to start overriding the woman's liberty?
Okay, so the court recognized two main state interests that actually get stronger as the pregnancy goes on.
Two interests. Okay.
First, protecting maternal health, making sure the procedures are safe. And second, the more contentious one, protecting potential human life.
And to manage this, the court created a literal sliding scale. This became the famous, or infamous, trimester framework.
Yes. And if you're listening, this is the one structure you really have to grasp to understand Roe. It divided pregnancy into 3 legal zones, and the balance of power just shifts dramatically from one to the next.
Okay, let's walk through it. First trimester.
In that first stage, the court said the woman's right is dominant, period.
Why?
Because they were looking at the medical data of the time, which showed that a first trimester abortion was actually safer than carrying the pregnancy to term.
So the state's interest in protecting the mother's health wasn't compelling yet.
It wasn't compelling yet, so the decision was left entirely to the woman and her doctor. The state couldn't really interfere.
Then you get to the second trimester. What changes?
Now, the state's interest in maternal health does become compelling.
Okay, why now?
Because the procedure generally becomes riskier as the pregnancy goes on. So the state could step in and regulate things related to the woman's health, like licensing for clinics or standards for equipment.
But they still couldn't ban it.
Still could not ban it. They could only regulate it for health and safety reasons.
And then finally we get to the third trimester, which is tied to the concept of viability.
Viability is the magic word here. It's the trigger. The court defined it as the point when the fetus can potentially survive outside the womb, even with medical help.
And once you hit viability?
Once you hit viability, the state's interest in protecting potential life becomes compelling.
And that's when the state can take much more dramatic action.
That's right. The state can regulate or even prohibit abortions after viability. But, and this is a huge exception, except when the procedure is necessary to save the life or the health of the mother.
So if we look back at that original Texas law, the one that started all this, it just becomes crystal clear why it was unconstitutional.
Oh, absolutely. The Texas law just swept way too broadly. It applied a third trimester level of restriction to the entire pregnancy. It completely ignored the woman's rights in the first and second trimesters.
It failed that compelling interest test.
It failed it completely.
Now, this brings us to the core controversy, the question the court had to face head-on, because it's where so much of the debate still lives.
The legal status of the fetus.
Right. Texas argued that a fetus is a person under the 14th Amendment from the moment of conception.
And if that were true, the case would be over. The fetus would have a constitutional right to life that would, likely override the woman's right to privacy.
So what did the court find when it actually analyzed that argument?
They looked at the history, at the text of the Constitution, and they found no constitutional support for the idea that a fetus is a person in the way the 14th Amendment uses that word.
How did they figure that out?
Well, they noted that every time the word person is used in the Constitution, it seems to apply only to people who have been born. And historically, the law just hadn't treated fetuses as persons with full legal rights.
And this rejection of fetal personhood is really the pivot point for everything that came after, isn't it?
It is. It established that the state's power to regulate abortion was tied to the medical reality of viability, not the philosophical or religious idea of conception.
It drew a clear legal line in the sand.
It did. And it was a flexible line. The court knew that as medicine advanced, the point of viability might shift. And if the medical line shifted, the legal line could shift with it. That was both the genius and the controversy of the framework.
So why are we still talking about a 1973 case today? I mean, it stood for nearly 50 years. Why didn't something else just replace it?
Because it set the entire legal vocabulary for this debate. Every single state law that came after it, parental consent laws, waiting periods, bans on specific procedures, all of them had to be measured against the Roe framework.
Can you give us an example of how that worked in practice?
Sure, take a much later case, Gonzalez v. Carhart in 2007. It was about a federal ban on a specific late-term abortion procedure.
Okay.
Even decades later, the whole analysis still revolved around the standard from Roe in later cases. Did this ban create an undue burden or a substantial obstacle for a woman seeking an abortion before viability?
So that language, undue burden, it only makes sense if you start from Roe's basic idea that there is a fundamental right there to begin with.
Exactly right. Roe gave the entire American legal system the structure to even talk about this. It defined personal liberty as something real, something that the state had to have a very good reason to interfere with.
So after this whole deep dive, what is the big so what? What's the key takeaway from the Roe decision?
The ruling said that in the early stages of pregnancy, the medical judgment of the woman and her doctor is primary. State intervention is the exception, not the rule, and it has to be justified by these compelling interests that grow over time.
It created boundaries for government action that were based on objective medical criteria, not on moral or philosophical beliefs.
That's a great way to put it.
And let's circle back to that core idea one last time. The right to personal liberty in pregnancy is protected, but it's not absolute. It exists in this constant tension with the state's interests.
Right. The state can't just ban the right. It has to justify its regulations with a compelling reason tied to the stage of pregnancy. The burden of proof was on the government, and it was a very high burden. That's the legacy.
You know, this whole deep dive wasn't really just about a medical procedure. It was about defining the legal boundaries of personal liberty itself.
It really was.
So if the right to privacy isn't explicitly written in the Constitution, but the court found it protects these fundamental decisions about family and health, it leaves us with a pretty profound question.
Which is?
What other essential, intimate decisions that are being debated today might also fall under that same umbrella of fundamental ordered liberty, just because they involve our most basic bodily autonomy or how we structure our lives?
And that forces us to keep asking, what is the true scope of liberty beyond just the words written on the page?
Something to think about long after this dive ends. Thanks for joining us.
You've been listening to The Daily Brief, one landmark court decision explained in plain English every day. Presented by FindCourtCases.com, this is your daily briefing on the law that shapes American life. Thanks for listening. We'll be back tomorrow with the next case.